Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of the most catastrophic events in human history. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to work at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, both before the April 26, 1986 disaster and during the horrific cleanup that followed. But forget the images of heroic scientists saving the world or the dramatized HBO miniseries version of events. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to Pripyat, Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, where the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was considered a prestigious posting, a symbol of Soviet technological achievement. This isn't the story of how the disaster happened, though we'll cover that. This is about what it meant to work there, the pride of being part of the nuclear program, the daily routines that seemed safe, the institutional failures that made catastrophe inevitable, and then the nightmare of being ordered to clean up radioactive contamination with inadequate protection while your government lied about the danger. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's walk through the gates of Chernobyl nuclear power plant and discover what it was really like to work in the shadow of Reactor 4. If you were hired to work at Chernobyl in the early 1980s, you were joining what was considered an elite institution. The nuclear power program was Soviet pride, evidence of technological superiority, provider of abundant clean energy, symbol of communist progress. Getting a job at Chernobyl meant good salary by Soviet standards, access to better housing in the purpose-built city of Pripyat just 3 kilometers from the plant, and prestige that came with being part of Soviet nuclear establishment. Your family would live in modern apartments with reliable hot water and electricity, luxuries that many Soviet citizens lacked. Pripyat was model Soviet city designed for nuclear workers and their families. Built starting in 1970, it had wide boulevards, parks, schools, a hospital, cinema, restaurants, and even an amusement park that opened just days before the disaster. By 1986, about 49,000 people lived there, mostly young families, since average age was only 20. The city was prosperous by Soviet standards, with well-stocked stores and cultural amenities. Living in Pripyat felt like being part of Soviet success story. Insulated from problems that plagued other parts of the USSR, your work at the plant depended on your role. If you were operator in the control room, you monitored gauges, adjusted controls, and maintained the reactor at optimal conditions. If you were engineer, you designed improvements, calculated safety margins, and solved technical problems. If you were maintenance worker, you repaired equipment, replaced parts, and kept the facility operational. If you were security personnel, you controlled access and protected what was considered strategically important facility. Whatever your role, you worked shifts, often 12 hours on, 24 hours off, rotating through day and night shifts. The RBMK reactor design that Chernobyl used was uniquely Soviet creation. Large, graphite-moderated, water-cooled reactor that could produce both electricity and plutonium for weapons. The design had serious flaws that Western nuclear engineers recognized, but Soviet engineers either didn't understand or weren't allowed to discuss. The positive void coefficient meant that if coolant was lost, the reaction would accelerate rather than slow down. Exactly opposite of safety principle. The control rods had graphite tips that briefly increased reactivity when first inserted, a design flaw that would prove catastrophic. But as worker, you probably didn't understand these design problems. You were told the reactor was safe, and you believed it. The safety culture at Chernobyl was compromised by Soviet institutional culture. Reporting problems could be interpreted as criticism of the system, which carried political risks. Managers were promoted based on meeting production targets, not safety records. Regulations existed, but were sometimes waived to meet deadlines or production quotas. Safety tests were postponed or conducted improperly to avoid disrupting operations. Equipment failures were common, but often patched rather than properly repaired because replacement parts were scarce in Soviet economy. You worked in an environment where everyone knew corners were being cut, but nobody felt empowered to demand better. The radiation exposure you experienced, even during normal operations, was higher than it should have been. The RBMK design allowed refueling while reactor was operating, which required workers to be near reactor core with minimal shielding. You wore dosimeter that measured your exposure, but the readings were often ignored or falsified to avoid exceeding official limits that would require pulling you from work. Chronic low-level exposure caused health problems that wouldn't manifest for years: increased cancer risk, immune system damage, premature aging. But in the 1980s, Soviet Union, with limited medical care and shorter life expectancy than the West, these long-term health effects were easy to ignore or attribute to other causes. The social life in Pripyat created tight-knit community. Your co-workers were also your neighbors. Their children attended school with your children. You socialized together on weekends. You shared the pride of being Chernobyl workers. This community feeling was genuine and positive. People who lived in Pripyat remember it fondly. As time they were young, optimistic, part of something important. The tragedy of what happened is partly that it destroyed this community, not just through death and displacement, but through the psychological trauma of realizing that the system you believed in had betrayed you. The training you received as operator or engineer was thorough in some respects, but inadequate in others. You learned normal operations extensively: how to start the reactor, maintain it at power, shut it down for refueling. You practiced responding to certain accident scenarios, but you weren't taught about the design flaws because officially they didn't exist. You weren't trained for the specific sequence of errors and equipment failures that would cause the disaster, because nobody imagined it could happen. The training assumed that if you followed procedures, the reactor was safe. This assumption was wrong. The evening of April 25, 1986, began what should have been routine safety test. The plan was to test whether the reactor's turbines could generate enough electricity during coast down to power emergency systems until backup generators started. This was an important safety question. In event of power loss, there would be a gap of about a minute before backup power came online. Could the spinning turbines bridge that gap? The test had been attempted before, but never successfully completed. This time, operators were determined to finish it. The test required reducing reactor power to low level, around 700, 1,000 megawatts thermal. But due to operator error and controller at regional power grid demanding that reactor stay at high power longer than planned, the power reduction was delayed and then performed too quickly. The reactor power plummeted to only 30 megawatts, far below the intended level and into dangerous range where reactor was difficult to control. The night shift operators, led by Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, faced choice: abort the test and try again another day, or proceed despite reactor being in unstable condition. Dyatlov decided to proceed. He was known as demanding supervisor who didn't tolerate objections. The operators, Leonid Toptonov at the controls and Alexander Akimov as shift foreman, were young and inexperienced. They raised concerns but ultimately followed orders. To increase power from dangerously low level, they withdrew most of the control rods, far more than regulations allowed. The reactor was now in incredibly dangerous configuration: unstable low power, insufficient control rods inserted, positive void, coefficient, ready to cause runaway reaction if anything went wrong. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the test began. The turbines were disconnected from the reactor and allowed to coast down, generating decreasing amounts of electricity. The cooling pumps powered by this decreasing electricity were pumping less water through the reactor core. With less water, steam bubbles formed, voids. The positive void coefficient meant these voids increased reactivity. Power began to rise. Toptonov, seeing the power increase, pressed the AZO5 button, emergency shutdown that should insert all control rods and stop the reaction. But the design flaw in the control rods meant that the graphite tips at the bottom of the rods briefly increased reactivity when first inserted. In the already unstable reactor, this was catastrophic. Power surged to perhaps 33,000 megawatts, 10 times normal maximum. The fuel rods shattered. Steam pressure blew apart the fuel channels. At 1:23:58, just seconds after the test began, the reactor exploded. Actually, 2 explosions. First one ruptured the reactor, second one, possibly hydrogen or steam explosion, blew off the 2,000-ton concrete lid covering the reactor core and destroyed the reactor hull. If you were in the control room, you felt the building shake violently. Lights went out briefly, then emergency lights came on. You heard the explosions, massive concussive blasts that everyone in the plant heard and felt. Through the windows, you would have seen pieces of burning graphite and reactor fuel shooting into the night sky like fireworks, landing on the roofs of adjacent buildings and starting fires. The control room instruments showed impossible readings: pipes ruptured, pressure lost, radiation levels off the charts. But the most chilling sight was through the door to the reactor hall. The roof was gone, and you could see straight up into the night sky, where the reactor should have been. Akimov and Toptonov couldn't accept what had happened. They insisted the reactor was intact, that the instruments were malfunctioning. Dyatlov, despite having seen the destroyed reactor hall himself, also denied the reactor had exploded, perhaps because accepting it would mean accepting responsibility. They sent workers to manually lower control rods that no longer existed into a reactor core that was blown apart. These workers received lethal radiation doses accomplishing nothing because the reactor they were trying to save was already destroyed. The firefighters who responded to the blaze were told it was ordinary fire and weren't warned about radiation. They climbed onto the roof of the turbine hall and adjacent buildings to extinguish fires caused by ejected graphite and reactor fuel. They were walking on pieces of the reactor core. Some fragments were emitting 20,000 roentgens per hour, a dose that would kill within minutes. Firefighter Vladimir Pravik and his crew fought the fires heroically, preventing them from spreading to Reactor 3. Within hours, most of them were vomiting and showing symptoms of severe radiation poisoning. catastrophic, and many of his firefighters would die within weeks. Their bodies so radioactive they had to be buried in lead-lined zinc coffins. The plant management's response was criminally inadequate. The plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, was more concerned with protecting his reputation than protecting people. He delayed calling Moscow, minimized the severity in reports, and allowed workers to continue operating the other reactors despite radiation levels that should have mandated immediate evacuation. The surviving night shift operators were not immediately relieved. Some stayed at their posts for hours, trying to manage the disaster while absorbing massive radiation doses. The radiation levels were difficult to comprehend. The dosimeters available at the plant maxed out at 3.6 roentgens per hour, already a dangerous level. When sent to measure radiation near the destroyed reactor, they immediately maxed out and stayed there. The actual levels were hundreds or thousands of times higher. But because the instruments couldn't measure it, supervisors convinced themselves, or pretended to convince themselves, that the levels couldn't be that high. It was a fatal combination of inadequate equipment and willful denial. The city of Pripyat was not immediately evacuated. For over 24 hours after the explosion, residents went about their daily routines unaware of the danger. Children played outside in the radioactive fallout. Some even collected pieces of graphite that had fallen from the sky, not knowing they were handling fragments of the reactor core. The authorities didn't want to cause panic or admit the severity of the disaster. They also genuinely seemed to not understand how dangerous the situation was. The Soviet nuclear establishment had convinced itself that a major reactor accident was impossible. The evacuation, when it finally came on April 27th, was presented as temporary. Residents were told to take only documents and essentials, that they would return in 3 days. They locked their apartments and left most possessions behind. They never returned. The evacuation itself was orderly. Plus 200 buses transported all 49,000 residents in about 3 hours. But the orderly evacuation masked the chaos and terror of abandoning your home, not knowing if you'd been exposed to lethal radiation, not understanding what had really happened at the plant where you or your spouse worked. If you were a plant worker who had been on duty during the disaster, you were likely now suffering from acute radiation syndrome. The symptoms began within hours: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, headaches. Your skin might be reddening, starting to show burns. You were taken to the hospital in Pripyat, then to Kiev, then to Moscow's Hospital No. 6, which specialized in radiation casualties. The doctors there had experience treating radiation exposure. The Soviet nuclear program had accidents before, though they were covered up. But they had never seen exposures this severe. The treatment for acute radiation syndrome was supportive care because there is no cure. The radiation had destroyed your bone marrow. You couldn't produce new blood cells. Your immune system was collapsing. Your intestinal lining was sloughing off. The doctors gave you blood transfusions, antibiotics to fight inevitable infections, and morphine for the pain. For those who had received the highest doses, like the firefighters and plant workers who directly entered the reactor building, death was certain. The only questions were how much they would suffer and how long it would take. Vasily Ignatenko, a firefighter who fought the roof fires, died on May 13, 1986, less than 3 weeks after the explosion. His pregnant wife Lyudmila had stayed with him in the hospital despite warnings about the radiation his body emitted. She held his hand, cleaned his wounds, tried to comfort him as his body disintegrated from the inside. He swelled up. His skin darkened and cracked. He bled from everywhere. He was in constant. By the end, he looked nothing like the handsome young man she'd married. Their baby, born months later, died within hours from birth defects, absorbed radiation from both parents. 28 plant workers and firefighters died from acute radiation syndrome in the first 3 months. These were the immediate deaths, the people who received doses so high that their bodies simply couldn't recover. But hundreds of others received doses that wouldn't kill immediately, but would cause cancers, immune disorders, and other health problems over the following decades. The plant workers who hadn't been on duty that night were now facing impossible choice: stay and help with the cleanup while absorbing significant radiation, or refuse and be branded as cowards who abandoned their duty. The Soviet government needed to contain the disaster both physically and politically. Physically, they needed to prevent the destroyed reactor from causing more damage, to put out the graphite fire, prevent the core from melting through the floor, stop the radioactive smoke from spreading more contamination. Politically, they needed to minimize the incident, prevent international embarrassment, and suppress any suggestion that Soviet nuclear technology was flawed. These priorities were sometimes in conflict. Effective cleanup required acknowledging the severity, but political concerns demanded minimizing it. The military was called in to manage the cleanup. Thousands of soldiers, reservists, and civilian volunteers, collectively called liquidators, were brought to Chernobyl to deal with the disaster. If you were liquidator, you might have been told you were volunteering for important patriotic duty, or you might have been simply ordered to go. You probably weren't told accurately about the radiation risks. The government line was that the danger was minimal and under control. Many liquidators later said they believed they were protecting their families and the world from nuclear catastrophe. And they were right about that, even though they were lied to about the personal cost. The immediate priority was the graphite fire in the destroyed reactor. Graphite was burning at temperatures over 2,000 degrees, and smoke was carrying radioactive particles across Europe. Military helicopters dropped thousands of tons of material onto the reactor: sand, clay, boron, lead, trying to smother the fire and absorb radiation. The helicopter pilots flew through the radioactive plume repeatedly, receiving massive doses. Some crashed when their instruments failed from radiation. The materials they dropped didn't reach their target effectively. Most missed the reactor cavity and piled up on surrounding structures. The graphite fire burned for about 10 days before finally being extinguished, not by the bombing, but by cutting off its oxygen supply. The roof of the adjacent Reactor 3 and surrounding buildings was covered with radioactive debris, pieces of reactor fuel, graphite, and other materials emitting lethal radiation. This debris needed to be cleared so construction could begin on the sarcophagus that would entomb Reactor 4. Robots were tried first. The Soviets sent in a moon rover they'd developed for space program, and the West Germans provided a robot specifically designed for radioactive environments. But the radiation levels were so high that the robot's electronics failed within minutes. The radiation fried their circuits faster than they could accomplish anything useful. That meant humans had to do it. The liquidators who cleared the roof became known as biorobots. Dark joke acknowledging that people were being used because machines couldn't survive. If you were one of these biorobots, you were given a lead suit that weighed about 60 pounds, a respirator, and told you had 90 seconds on the roof before your radiation exposure reached the safe limit of 25 roentgens. In reality, levels on the roof were thousands of roentgens per hour. You were getting lethal doses in those 90 seconds, but the commanders needed the debris cleared, and they needed people willing to do it. You climbed stairs to the roof with your lead suit, making every step exhausting. You reached the designated area, a section of roof perhaps 10 meters square. A supervisor with stopwatch started your time. You picked up pieces of graphite or reactor fuel with a shovel. Each piece was so radioactive it would kill you if you stood near it for minutes, and threw them back into the reactor cavity. The debris was heavy. Your suit was heavy. You were struggling to breathe through the respirator, and you knew that every second on that roof was damaging your body. At 90 seconds, the whistle blew, and you ran back to the stairs. You were done. Your lifetime exposure limit had been reached, and you were rotated out. In reality, you just absorbed dose that would cause cancer, immune problems, and premature death. But you'd done your duty. Roughly 3,500 men cleared the roof this way in autumn 1986. Many are dead now. Most survivors have serious health problems. The construction of the sarcophagus, the massive concrete and steel structure that would encase Reactor 4, was engineering marvel accomplished under impossible conditions. Workers built it piece by piece while being bombarded with radiation. Every task took longer because workers could only stay in high radiation areas for minutes at a time before having to be relieved. Special concrete was poured remotely using pumps because workers couldn't stay near forms long enough to pour normally. Steel beams were positioned using cranes operated from maximum possible distance. The entire structure was completed in only 6 months, from June to November 1986. A remarkable feat accomplished by rotating thousands of workers through brief exposure periods. But the sarcophagus was never intended to be a permanent solution. It was an emergency measure built quickly under difficult conditions. The design had problems. It wasn't fully sealed. It didn't prevent rainwater from entering and corroding the reactor remains. It wasn't stable enough to last more than a few decades. But in 1986, the priority was containing the immediate danger, not engineering a permanent solution. That problem was left for the future, a future that would require building a new safe confinement decades later, at cost of billions of euros. The decontamination of the surrounding area involved bizarre and disturbing tasks. Soldiers shot all the animals in the evacuation zone, pets that residents had left behind, livestock, wild animals. The animals had been exposed to radiation and could spread contamination. They couldn't be allowed to wander, so soldiers went through evacuated villages, shooting dogs, cats, horses, cows. Some liquidators still have nightmares about killing pets that had waited loyally for owners who would never return. The animal carcasses were then buried in concrete-lined pits. The topsoil in the most contaminated areas was scraped away and buried. Trees in the red forest, the area closest to the reactor where trees had died and turned red-brown from radiation, were cut down and buried. Buildings were washed with special solutions trying to reduce contamination, though with limited success. Villages within 30-kilometer exclusion zone were bulldozed and buried. It was scorched earth approach to contamination. If something was radioactive and couldn't be decontaminated, bury it and mark the location on maps that future generations might consult. If you were a liquidator working on these decontamination tasks, you wore protective gear that was often inadequate. You might have respirator that didn't seal properly, or thin cotton coveralls when you needed lead shielding. You worked alongside soldiers who were even less protected, young conscripts in standard military uniforms with maybe a cloth mask. The doses you received weren't monitored carefully. Dosimeters were in short supply, and those that existed were often not checked regularly. Your exposure was estimated based on how long you worked in what areas, not measured individually. The psychological toll on liquidators was severe. You were doing necessary work. Without the cleanup, the disaster would have been far worse, but you knew you were being sacrificed. The government praised liquidators as heroes while lying about the radiation risks. You worked alongside people who became sick and died, and you wondered when your turn would come. The combination of physical danger, awareness of being lied to, and witnessing suffering created trauma that lasted decades. Many liquidators struggled with depression, anxiety, and survivor guilt. Suicide rates among liquidators are higher than general population. The workers at reactors 1, 2, and 3 were in impossible situation. These reactors shared ventilation systems and infrastructure with the destroyed reactor 4. They were contaminated, their control rooms had elevated radiation levels, and the remaining reactor personnel had to work in conditions that were never meant to exist. But the Soviet government needed the electricity these reactors produced. The power grid depended on Chernobyl's output, so the reactors were restarted despite the risks. Reactor 1 restarted in October 1986, just 6 months after the disaster, before cleanup was complete, while Reactor 4 was still being entombed. Reactor 2 restarted in November 1986. Reactor 3, which shared a building with the destroyed Reactor 4, restarted in December 1987. If you were operator at one of these reactors, you worked in building that was partially destroyed, with radiation levels in some areas high enough to cause concern, knowing that you were likely receiving exposures that would affect your health. But you also needed the job, the salary, the apartment in replacement housing, and the government told you it was safe. The health effects on plant workers and liquidators became undeniable over time, though the government tried to suppress and minimize the data. The immediate deaths from acute radiation syndrome numbered 28 in official Soviet accounts, though some researchers believe the actual number was higher when including less severe cases that contributed to earlier deaths, but the long-term effects were far more widespread. Cancer rates among liquidators and exposed plant workers are significantly higher than general population, particularly thyroid cancer, leukemia, and other radiation-sensitive cancers. Thyroid cancer in children from contaminated areas became epidemic. Radioactive iodine released during the disaster accumulated in thyroid glands, especially in children who drank contaminated milk. By the 1990s, thousands of children who had been toddlers in 1986 were developing thyroid cancer, a disease that was previously extremely rare in children. The WHO estimated that 5,000 thyroid cancer cases in children could be attributed to Chernobyl, though Ukrainian and Belarusian researchers believe the number is higher. Most survived with treatment, but required lifelong medication and lived with awareness that radiation had given them cancer. The genetic effects are harder to document, but deeply concerning. Radiation causes DNA damage that can be passed to offspring. The children of liquidators and exposed workers show higher rates of certain genetic disorders and health problems. The scientific community debates the extent of these effects. Some studies show clear increases. Others are less conclusive. But for families affected, the statistics don't matter as much as the reality of children born with problems that may or may not be linked to parents' radiation exposure. The uncertainty itself is burden. Not knowing if your child's illness was caused by what happened to you at Chernobyl. The Soviet government's response to liquidators and affected workers was callous bureaucracy. You were supposed to receive benefits, additional vacation time, better medical care, early retirement, monetary compensation. In reality, accessing these benefits required navigating corrupt system where documentation was often lost, where you had to prove exposure that the government had never properly documented, where officials denied problems to avoid paying benefits. Many liquidators died before receiving any compensation. Others spent years fighting bureaucracy for recognition and support they deserved. The trial of plant personnel in summer 1987 was show trial designed to assign blame while protecting the system. Viktor Bryukhanov, plant director, Nikolai Fomin, chief engineer, and Anatoly Dyatlov, deputy chief engineer, were convicted of safety violations and sentenced to prison labor camp terms. They were scapegoats. They made mistakes and bear some responsibility, but the disaster was caused by fundamental design flaws in the RBMK reactor that Soviet nuclear establishment knew about, but concealed. The operators who actually pushed the buttons, Akimov and Toptonov, were dead from radiation poisoning and couldn't defend themselves. The reactor designers and government officials who created the conditions for disaster were never prosecuted. Dyatlov's trial testimony was bitter. He knew he was being sacrificed, that the real culprits, the people who designed a flawed reactor and created a culture where safety violations were routine, would escape responsibility. His book, Chernobyl, How It Was, published years later, is angry account that blames the reactor design and the system while defending his actions. Whether you view him as victim or culprit depends on how you balance individual responsibility against systemic failures. He made deadly decisions that night, but he made them in system that set him up to fail. The international response to Chernobyl exposed Soviet secrecy. For the first 36 hours after the explosion, the Soviet government said nothing. The world learned about Chernobyl when Swedish nuclear plants detected radioactive particles on Monday, April 28th. Particles that clearly came from major reactor accident somewhere. The Swedes alerted international authorities. Only then, forced by foreign detection, did the Soviets admit an accident had occurred. Even then, they minimized the severity, claiming the situation was under control and radiation releases were limited. The radioactive cloud from Chernobyl spread across Europe, depositing contamination from Belarus and Ukraine through Scandinavia, down through Central Europe, and even to parts of Britain and France. The amount of radioactive material released was roughly 400 times more than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, though spread over a much larger area and different isotopes with different half-lives. Countries across Europe had to deal with contaminated farmland, contaminated milk, from cows eating contaminated grass, contaminated meat, from wild game. The disaster affected food production across a continent. The exclusion zone around Chernobyl, initially 30 kilometers, later adjusted based on actual contamination patterns, encompasses about 2,600 square kilometers and remains largely uninhabited. The city of Pripyat is frozen in time, a ghost city where apartments still contain belongings left behind during hasty evacuation, where amusement park was never officially opened, where trees grow through buildings and nature reclaims what humans abandoned. It's post-apocalyptic landscape that attracts tourists now. Dark tourism, where visitors pay to see disaster site. The tourists walk through Pripyat wearing dosimeters, taking photos of abandoned schools and rusting Ferris wheel, trying to comprehend what happened here. But the exclusion zone isn't completely empty. Some elderly residents, mostly women who were evacuated in 1986, returned illegally to their homes within months or years and still live there. They're called self-settlers, or samosli. The government eventually stopped trying to evict them. They were mostly elderly, they accepted the risks, and they preferred to die in their homes rather than die in unfamiliar displacement housing. They grow their own food in contaminated soil, drink water from contaminated wells, and live with radiation levels that would be unacceptable elsewhere. Studies of these residents show increased cancer rates and other health problems, but many lived into their 70s and 80s. Radiation is statistical risk, not guaranteed death sentence, and the risk depends on exposure levels and individual factors. The workers who still work at Chernobyl, and yes, there are still workers there, face different conditions than pre-disaster workers, but still significant challenges. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 continued operating until 2000, when Ukraine finally shut down the last reactor under international pressure. But decommissioning work continues. Workers maintain the sarcophagus, monitor radiation levels, manage radioactive waste, and construct the new safe confinement, the massive structure built between 2010 and 2019 to enclose the original sarcophagus, which was deteriorating. The new safe confinement is engineering marvel, the largest movable structure ever built by humans. It's 36,000 tons of steel, spanning 257 meters wide, 164 meters long, and 108 meters high. It was built on rails away from the reactor and then slid into place over the old sarcophagus in November 2016, moved just a few meters per day to avoid stressing the structure. It's designed to last 100 years and allow eventual dismantling of the reactor remains, though that work will take decades and hasn't really begun yet. The workers who build it and who maintain it now work in contaminated area, though with much better protection than liquidators had in 1986. The psychological impact on survivors, workers, liquidators, evacuees, is complex and often overlooked. You might have survivor guilt from living when co-workers died. You might have anger at government that lied to you and sacrificed you. You might have fear about your health and your children's health. You might have grief for lost community, lost home, lost certainty about the future. The Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991, just 5 years after Chernobyl, and many see connection. The disaster exposed Soviet failures in ways that accelerated the system's collapse. For those who believed in Soviet system, Chernobyl was betrayal that destroyed faith as surely as it destroyed their health. The debate about death toll from Chernobyl is contentious and political. The official UN report in 2005 estimated that 4,000 people might eventually die from radiation-related cancers. Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian researchers argue the number is far higher, perhaps 100,000 or more when accounting for all liquidators, evacuees, and people living in contaminated areas. The debate isn't purely scientific. It involves politics, liability, and how deaths are attributed when radiation increases cancer risk but doesn't uniquely cause cancers that have other causes too. A liquidator who dies of leukemia at age 50, did Chernobyl kill him? Or would he have gotten leukemia anyway? The statistical answer involves comparing populations, but the human answer is that he wouldn't have been exposed if he hadn't been sent to Chernobyl. The economic cost of Chernobyl is estimated at hundreds of billions of dollars when accounting for immediate response, long-term health care, lost economic productivity from exclusion zone, decommissioning costs, and ongoing monitoring and maintenance. For Ukraine and Belarus, countries that bore most of the contamination, Chernobyl has been massive drain on resources. The Ukrainian government still spends several percent of national budget on Chernobyl-related expenses. The disaster continues to cost money and resources 35-plus years later and will continue for decades more. The lessons from Chernobyl for nuclear power industry were mixed. On one hand, the disaster led to major safety improvements worldwide, better reactor designs, improved safety culture, international cooperation on nuclear safety, understanding that accidents in one country can affect many countries. The IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, strengthened protocols for reporting accidents and sharing information. Western reactors already had better safety features than the RBMK, but they were further improved. The nuclear industry took Chernobyl seriously as warning about what could happen if safety was compromised. On the other hand, Chernobyl energized anti-nuclear movements and contributed to stagnation of nuclear power development in many countries. Germany began phasing out nuclear power. Austria, which had built nuclear plant, decided never to operate it. Public fear of nuclear energy increased, making new plant construction politically difficult. Whether this reaction was rational, nuclear power, even accounting for accidents, causes fewer deaths per unit energy than fossil fuels, is debatable. But the emotional impact of Chernobyl was profound. The image of Pripyat's abandoned amusement park became symbol of nuclear power's dangers. The Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, caused by earthquake and tsunami, very different circumstances from Chernobyl, showed that catastrophic nuclear accidents remain possible even with modern reactors and safety culture. The parallels and differences between Chernobyl and Fukushima are instructive. Fukushima had better initial response, better containment, less immediate radiation release, but still resulted in evacuation, contamination, and long-term consequences. Both disasters show that nuclear power's low probability, high consequence risks create challenges that engineering and regulation struggle to completely eliminate. The question of whether Chernobyl workers were heroes or victims is false dichotomy. They were both. The firefighters who fought the initial blaze, the plant workers who tried to control the reactor, the liquidators who cleared the roof and built the sarcophagus, they prevented the disaster from being even worse. If they hadn't acted, more reactors could have been damaged, more radiation released, more of Europe contaminated. Their courage and sacrifice genuinely protected millions of people from worse outcomes. They deserve recognition as heroes, but they were also victims of a system that lied to them about dangers, that designed flawed reactors, that prioritized political concerns over human safety, that sent them into lethal radiation with inadequate protection. They didn't volunteer with full knowledge of risks. They were often ordered to go or misled about dangers. Many paid with their health and lives for government's mistakes. Their heroism doesn't erase their victimization. If anything, it makes it more tragic. They showed the best of human courage in responding to disaster caused by the worst of human failures. The memory of Chernobyl in former Soviet countries is complicated by Soviet collapse. For some, especially older generations, there's nostalgia for Soviet era when Pripyat was thriving city and nuclear program was source of pride. For others, especially younger generation, Chernobyl symbolizes everything wrong with Soviet system: secrecy, lies, disregard for human life, technological hubris. The same event is remembered differently depending on political perspective and personal experience. The physical legacy of Chernobyl will outlast anyone alive today. The radioactive contamination includes isotopes with half-lives ranging from days to thousands of years. Cesium-137, a major component of contamination, has half-life of 30 years. It was half as radioactive in 2016 as it was in 1986, and will be half as radioactive in 2046 as it is now. But plutonium-239, also present, has half-life of 24,000 years. The exclusion zone will be contaminated for longer than recorded human history to date. Future generations will inherit this radioactive legacy, requiring monitoring and management for timescales that dwarf normal planning horizons. The workers at Chernobyl, before and after the disaster, were ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Before April 26, 1986, they were proud employees of prestigious institution, doing work they believed was important and safe. After the disaster, they became emergency responders, cleanup workers, victims, and eventually historical figures whose experiences would be studied and debated for decades. Most didn't want to be heroes or martyrs. They just wanted to do their job, support their families, and live normal lives. The disaster took that possibility away from them. The specific personal stories that have been documented bring statistics to life in painful ways. Lyudmila Ignatenko, the firefighter's wife who stayed with her dying husband despite warnings, gave birth to daughter who lived only 4 hours. She later remarried and had son who survived, but carries guilt and grief about her first child's death. Her story, told in Svetlana Alexievich's book, Voices from Chernobyl, is heartbreaking account of love, loss, and the impossibility of protecting those you love from invisible threat. Boris Stolyarchuk, a plant worker who was in reactor hall when it exploded, received dose estimated at 1/300 roentgens, enough to kill most people. He survived, though, with severe health problems and lived until 2020, 34 years after the disaster. His survival is statistical outlier. Most people with similar exposures died within weeks. Why did he survive? Combination of luck, perhaps genetic factors that made him more resistant, medical care, and sheer determination. His survival doesn't diminish the tragedy of those who died, but it shows that radiation's effects, while predictable statistically, vary dramatically between individuals. Anatoly Sitnikov, a plant engineer who was sent to the roof of reactor building to assess damage in the hours after explosion, received lethal dose estimated at 1,500 roentgens during his brief inspection. He reported back that the reactor was destroyed, contradicting Dyatlov's insistence that it was intact. Sitnikov died 2 weeks later from acute radiation syndrome. He was 47 years old, leaving wife and children. His death was particularly cruel because he was sent on mission that everyone should have known was suicide, to confirm what was already obvious, by supervisors who couldn't accept reality. Valery Kodamchuk, a pump operator, was almost certainly killed instantly when the reactor exploded. His body was never recovered and is presumably still entombed in the reactor remains. He was 35 years old. His death was immediate, and he probably never knew what hit him, which might be mercy compared to dying slowly from radiation poisoning. His name is on memorial at Chernobyl site, but his body lies somewhere in the radioactive rubble, unreachable and unrecoverable. He is Chernobyl's tomb of unknown worker, representing all those whose stories are lost. Nikolai Gorbachenko, a night shift worker, ran to the destroyed reactor immediately after explosion to manually open valves, trying to supply cooling water to a reactor that no longer existed. He received massive dose, accomplishing nothing because the cooling system was destroyed. He died May 11, 1986, from acute radiation syndrome. He was 27 years old. His actions were brave and futile, responding to training and instinct to save the reactor when the reactor was already beyond saving. His death exemplifies the tragedy of workers trying to do their duty in situations where their training didn't apply and their sacrifice couldn't change the outcome. Vladimir Shashanok, a plant worker who was badly burned by the explosion itself, died 6 hours after the disaster, the first death, before anyone had died from radiation. His death reminds us that the explosion was physical catastrophe before it was radiological one. The steam explosion, the structural collapse, the fires, these immediate effects killed and injured people before radiation did. Shashanok was 35 years old. His rapid death spared him the prolonged suffering of radiation poisoning, but he still died violently and young because of failures that shouldn't have happened. Mostly the elderly residents who returned to their homes in the exclusion zone represent defiant human desire to live on own terms despite danger. Hanna Zavorotina lived in village within exclusion zone until she died at age 88 in 2009. She grew her own vegetables, kept chickens, lived without electricity or running water, and refused to leave despite radiation levels that exceeded safety standards. For her, living in her family home was more important than living longer elsewhere. Her choice was rational by her values, even if it was irrational by safety standards. Her life in exclusion zone was harder than it would have been elsewhere, but it was her life in her home, and that mattered to her. The workers who maintain new safe confinement and monitor the site today have different experience than liquidators or pre-disaster workers. You work in exclusion zone, but with proper protection, careful dose monitoring, and shift patterns that limit exposure. You might work 2 weeks at Chernobyl, then 2 weeks at home. Your cumulative annual dose is kept well below levels that liquidators received in days or weeks. You're paid well by Ukrainian standards because of risk premium and because skilled workers willing to work at Chernobyl are scarce. You're part of ongoing management of disaster that will require human attention for generations. The tourists who visit Chernobyl now, and tourism has boomed, especially after HBO miniseries dramatized the disaster, walk through landscape that liquidators died cleaning. You wear dosimeter, listen to guide, explain what happened, take photos of abandoned buildings, and leave after a day with radiation exposure equivalent to few hours of airplane flight. Your visit is safe, regulated, monitored, but it's also strange. Treating disaster site as attraction, walking through city where people lived and died, seeing playground that children never got to use. Dark tourism at Chernobyl raises questions about appropriateness, remembrance, and whether horror should be entertainment. The pop culture representations of Chernobyl, video games set in exclusion zone, movies about disaster, HBO miniseries, shape how younger generations understand what happened. The HBO series Chernobyl was remarkably accurate in many respects, but also dramatized, condensed, and simplified complex events for narrative purposes. It brought Chernobyl to global audience who might not otherwise know the story, but it also created iconic images that aren't quite historically accurate. The challenge is balancing drama that engages audiences with accuracy that honors those who lived through it. The lessons about institutional failure, safety culture, transparency, and accountability extend far beyond nuclear power. Chernobyl happened because people in charge prioritized production over safety, because design flaws were concealed rather than addressed, because workers weren't trained on actual risks, because bureaucracy valued meeting targets over protecting people, because secrecy prevented effective response. These failures recur in different industries and different disasters. The specific technology changes, but the human failures repeat, cutting corners, hiding problems, ignoring warnings, valuing short-term gains over long-term safety. The question of whether nuclear power should be part of our energy future is complicated by Chernobyl's legacy. Modern reactors have passive safety features that RBMK lacked. They shut down automatically in certain failure modes rather than requiring active intervention. Safety culture in Western nuclear industry is stronger than Soviet nuclear establishment, but accidents remain possible. The probability is low, but consequences are high. And Chernobyl showed that impossible accidents can happen when multiple failures cascade. Whether the benefits of nuclear power, zero carbon emissions, reliable baseload power, outweigh the catastrophic risk of accidents is ethical and practical question that societies must answer. The radiation that remains in exclusion zone is invisible, odorless, tasteless, undetectable by human senses. You need instruments to know it's there. This invisible danger is psychologically difficult. If radiation glowed or smelled, people's fear would be more proportionate to actual risk. But invisible threat is either overfeared or underfeared. People either panic about tiny exposures or dismiss significant risks because they can't sense the danger. The liquidators clearing the roof couldn't see, hear, or feel the radiation killing them. They only knew it was dangerous because they were told, and often they were lied to about just how dangerous. The long-term environmental effects in exclusion zone are complex. Without humans, wildlife has returned: wolves, bears, wild horses, even endangered species like Przewalski's horses that were introduced. The forest has expanded, reclaiming agricultural land. In some ways, exclusion zone is thriving ecosystem. But this doesn't mean radiation is harmless. Wildlife shows genetic damage, elevated mutation rates, higher cancer rates in some species. The zone is simultaneously nature reserve and radioactive wasteland. Life persists, but it's stressed life adapting to contaminated environment. The lesson isn't that radiation is safe. It's that absence of humans allows ecosystem recovery despite radiation. Because humans are more destructive to biodiversity than even nuclear disasters are. The geopolitical implications of Chernobyl included accelerating Soviet collapse and changing international nuclear safety cooperation. Mikhail Gorbachev later said that Chernobyl was perhaps real cause of Soviet Union's fall, more than any political or economic factor. The disaster exposed Soviet incompetence, the government's lies to its own people, the system's inability to handle crisis. It destroyed the myth of Soviet technological superiority. It cost enormous sums that Soviet economy couldn't afford. It demoralized population who realized their government had sacrificed them. Chernobyl didn't cause glasnost and perestroika, but it made them necessary. The international response to Chernobyl created precedents for cross-border disaster management. The Convention on Early Notification of a Nuclear Accident was signed in 1986, requiring countries to immediately notify others if radioactive release crosses borders. The Convention on Assistance in the case of a nuclear accident established framework for international aid. These treaties emerged directly from Chernobyl experience, where Soviet secrecy endangered other countries. The accident forced recognition that nuclear safety is international concern, not just national sovereignty. The commemoration of Chernobyl on its anniversaries, especially the 25th and 30th, brought survivors together and focused international attention on ongoing consequences. These commemorations are bittersweet, honoring the dead and recognizing survivors while also acknowledging that justice was never fully achieved, that many responsible were never held accountable, that survivors continue struggling for recognition and support. The memorials at Chernobyl site list names of firefighters and plant workers who died from acute radiation syndrome. But names of liquidators who died later from cancers aren't included. There are too many, and determining which deaths were caused by Chernobyl is contentious. The children born after Chernobyl to exposed parents or in contaminated areas carry physical and psychological burden. Even if they're healthy, they worry about genetic effects manifesting later. Even if health statistics show they're fine, they feel marked by disaster they didn't cause and barely remember. They grew up with Chernobyl as defining feature of their identity. I'm from Pripyat. My father was a liquidator. I was evacuated as a baby. The disaster shaped their lives even though they weren't conscious participants in it. So the next time you encounter Chernobyl in media or conversation, the abandoned amusement park photo that's become iconic, the HBO series that won Emmys, the debates about nuclear power safety, remember the plant workers who came to work on April 26, 1986, expecting normal shift and found themselves. Remember the firefighters who climbed ladders not knowing they were walking into lethal radiation. Remember the liquidators told they were volunteering for important work, not told they were being sacrificed. Remember the children who collected pretty graphite pieces, not knowing they were handling reactor core fragments. Remember the families torn apart by death, disease, and displacement. Working at Chernobyl before the disaster meant pride in Soviet achievement, belief in nuclear power's promise, and confidence that the system protected you. Working at Chernobyl after the disaster meant horror, sacrifice, anger at being lied to, and slow realization that your health had been traded for damage control. Working at Chernobyl today means maintaining technological solution to problem that should never have occurred, managing legacy that will outlast everyone alive, and remembering disaster so that lessons aren't lost. The courage of Chernobyl workers is real and deserves recognition. The catastrophic failures that put them in that position deserve equal recognition so they're not repeated. The truth is more complicated than heroic narratives or simple blame. It involves brave individuals, terrible decisions, systemic failures, government lies, and consequences still unfolding decades later. Understanding Chernobyl honestly means holding all these truths simultaneously. And so ends our journey through Chernobyl's reality. If you enjoyed this exploration of what working there actually meant, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of the Chernobyl story affected you most, or suggest another topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler, and maybe tonight, appreciate that you can trust your government's information about safety risks, not perfectly, but better than Soviet workers could trust theirs. Appreciate that modern safety culture, while imperfect, exists because of disasters like Chernobyl that taught brutal lessons. Appreciate that invisible dangers, radiation, pollution, toxins, are monitored by institutions that, while flawed, generally try to protect you. And appreciate that the ordinary work you do probably won't require extraordinary sacrifice to fix someone else's catastrophic mistakes. Sweet dreams. End of script. The ultimate tragedy of Chernobyl isn't just that disaster happened, but that it was preventable. Every failure that caused it, the flawed reactor design, the inadequate training, the culture that discouraged reporting problems, the tests conducted despite unsafe conditions, the emergency shutdown that made things worse, was known or knowable before that night. The information existed somewhere in Soviet nuclear establishment that RBMK reactors had dangerous characteristics. The design flaw in control rods had been identified, but not corrected. The culture of prioritizing production over safety was widespread and recognized. The disaster happened because institutional failures accumulated until catastrophe became inevitable, and then individual mistakes at critical moment triggered it. For workers who believed in Soviet system, Chernobyl was profound betrayal. You were told nuclear power was safe. You were told the state protected its workers. You were told Soviet science and engineering were world's best. Chernobyl proved all these claims were lies. The reactor wasn't safe. The state sacrificed workers to protect its reputation. Soviet engineering had produced dangerously flawed design and then concealed the flaws. The workers who suffered most were those who believed most completely, who trusted the system, did what they were told, and discovered too late that trust was misplaced. The comparison with other industrial disasters, Bhopal, Deepwater Horizon, the Aberfan coal tip collapse, reveals common patterns. Chernobyl wasn't unique except in scale and technology. The institutional failures that caused it happen repeatedly in different industries. Cost-cutting that compromises safety, regulations ignored to meet targets, warnings dismissed, complex systems not fully understood by operators, government or corporate cover-ups prioritizing liability over truth. The specific circumstances change, but the human failures repeat. Chernobyl is cautionary tale not just about nuclear power, but about how institutional dysfunction creates disasters, and how the powerful sacrifice the powerless to avoid responsibility. The workers who cleaned up Chernobyl saved Europe from worse contamination. If the graphite fire hadn't been put out, if the remaining reactors had been damaged, if the radioactive smoke had continued unchecked, the disaster would have been far worse. The liquidators' work, however dangerous and however poorly protected they were, prevented catastrophic scenarios that would have contaminated even more of Europe. Their sacrifice genuinely mattered. The sarcophagus they built prevented decades of additional contamination. The immediate deaths and long-term health problems they suffered bought time and protection for millions who never knew how close they came to worse outcomes. But recognizing their sacrifice doesn't excuse how they were treated. Heroes shouldn't be created by sending inadequately protected people into lethal situations and lying about the risks. Effective disaster response shouldn't require sacrificing responders. The fact that liquidators saved the day doesn't justify the decisions that put them in that position or the lies they were told about safety. You can honor their courage while condemning the system that required it and the officials who misled them. Both responses are morally necessary. The legacy of Chernobyl for nuclear power remains contested. Some argue it proves nuclear power is too dangerous to be used. Others argue it proves that even worst-case accident in fundamentally flawed reactor design killed far fewer people than fossil fuel air pollution kills annually. The statistics support nuclear power. Fewer deaths per unit energy than coal or oil, even accounting for accidents. But statistics don't capture the qualitative difference between distributed deaths from air pollution and concentrated catastrophe of nuclear disaster. They don't account for psychological impact of invisible threat or the multi-generational contamination. The debate isn't purely technical, but involves values, how we weight different types of risk, how we value present benefits versus future costs, how we balance statistical lives against individual suffering. Working at Chernobyl meant being part of history you never wanted to make. It meant pride transformed into horror, routine transformed into nightmare, and trust transformed into betrayal. It meant ordinary people facing extraordinary dangers because systems failed and leaders lied. It meant courage that should never have been necessary and sacrifice that should never have been required. That is the reality of Chernobyl that no memorial fully captures and no statistic completely measures. That is the truth we must remember.